Yeah, so our previous sessions can be viewed on our YouTube page. So these are things on topics like paper writing, postdocs, research fellowships, peer review. So please go and view those afterwards if they're of interest. And if you have any other ideas for future things you'd like us to cover, then please let either myself or Sophie know. So today our topic is things I wish I knew when I started my PhD. And I'm really glad we've got these four people, either PhD students or recently graduated PhD students with us to share their experiences. But before we start, I just want to remind you who the Geochemistry group is. So we're a special interest group of the Mineralogical Society of the UK and Ireland and the Joel Sock of London. And the goal really here is to promote geochemistry as a discipline and again to support you, the early career geochemical community. Equally, our events are not exclusive to geochemists. People from any disciplines are welcome, and of course, many of the ideas that will come to PhD students in geochemistry will be relevant to those of you in other subjects as well. So, also just a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards. Please abide by the Geochemistry Group's Code of Conduct and be respectful of each other, basically. And yeah, just a big thank you to those of you who've already sent us questions. So I have this list here with me and we'll go through those today. But also if you have any questions that you haven't come to mind as we're sat here in the session, then please just put those in the Q&A box. Okay, and so over to our speakers today, our panelists for today. I'm really pleased we've got all these people with us. So this is Joel Rodney from Bristol, Sophie Slater from Cardiff, Molly Trudgill from LSCE, and Bridget Warren from the Open University. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and let you see our panelists. And great, so they're all there. So let's start. And the first question I just want to ask you to do is to introduce yourself. So what was your PhD research about and what are you doing right now? So Molly, I can see you on my screen, so maybe do you want to start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Molly. I did my PhD at St Andrews, looking at using the boron isotope proxy in the geological record. And so my PhD was kind of a mix of a bunch of method development and also a bunch of kind of paleoclimate. And these days I'm a postdoc at LSCE, just outside of Paris. And I have stuck with the boron isotopes, but abandoned the deep time for some more shallow time and looking at the last deglaciation and carbon cycling in the ocean.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Maybe Bridget, do you want to go next?
Yep. So hi, I'm Bridget. I did my PhD at the University of Birmingham. It was mostly, I'm an organic geochemist, so I was mostly looking at how modern plants responded to CO2 with an eye to then using that for how they respond in the geologic record, with a little bit of the alkanone CO2 proxies. We've got two CO2 people from rather different proxies, which is kind of neat. I'm now a postdoc at the Open University, and I am now doing the alkanone CO2 proxy full-time, mostly in the Pliocene.
Great, thank you. Joel, maybe you want to go next.
Hi, I'm Joel. I'm a postdoc at Bristol. I've done my PhD at Bristol and just finished in August this year. I use novel stable isotopes like uranium, molybdenum, and potassium just to investigate fractal recycling and mantle geochemistry. So it's just about what happens when you mix oceanic crust back into the mantle and create a sort of subducting zone. And right now, yeah, I just started a postdoc a couple of months ago at Bristol, more now linking geochemistry and geodynamics together and just looking at big scale mantle convection stuff.
That's great. Yeah, so you've got our hard rock geochemist. And finally, Sophie.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sophie. I'm still doing my PhD at Cardiff. I'm in the middle of writing up at the moment. I'm looking at the Eocene and Ligocene transition using trace metals in forams and what they can tell us about temperature changes, hydrological changes.
Perfect. All right. So the first question then, the first sort of theme is thinking about choosing a topic, choosing an institution. And first question, how did you choose the topic you wish to work on? And someone can just jump in.
I could start again. I think for me, I knew that broadly the thing that excited me in science when I was looking for PhDs was that I really liked paleoclimate and the ability that we have to look back in the Earth's history. And for me, geochemistry was the kind of coolest toolkit that I knew to do that. And so I was kind of looking generally for projects that were using geochemistry to understand the Earth's history and kind of, that kind of thing, and just kind of looked out for projects that seemed exciting. And this was the one that seemed the most exciting. So that's what I picked.
I'm happy to go next. So I got into it because of paleoclimate. I guess when I heard about that in my undergrad, I was just amazed and knew that I wanted to do something to do with that. And I worked a couple of technician jobs with bivalves, and then came down to Cardiff and started working with forams also as a technician, and kept my eye out for an interesting looking PhD that used those with geochemical methods, and found one.
Great, it's quite similar then to Molly.
I can give you something slightly different, which is I tried to do exactly the same thing, which was my master's was in forams, and I was really interested in paleoclimate, etc., etc. And then when it came to actually applying for PhDs, I happened to get this interview for this one looking at modern plants and CO2. And I figured I needed the interview experience anyway, not knowing anything about plants or being a biologist. So I emailed back and forth a bit with the supervisor and got various bits of advice from people in my master's and did a load of reading for the interview. And then it suddenly turned out that I was really quite interested in that kind of thing too. So, I mean, I never abandoned paleo. I'm still doing it. I'm doing paleo properly again now. But I just found that because I'd looked into this project a bit, it turned out it was really interesting, even though I hadn't even known it was something to look for.
Cool. That's quite useful.
Yeah.
Joel?
Yes, I'd always sort of knew I wanted to do sort of big scale picture stuff with like how the Earth works. And so what I decided to do was I had a look around some of the projects that are out there and got in contact with the supervisor of the project, sent them a few emails, read a few of their papers, and just picked the ones which seemed most interesting to me really, and that I seemed to get along with overall, and then knew that I wanted to do something lab-based. I quite like the do the methodical work of it, and just this project seems perfect.
Great. Well, it all sounds like it's worked out. We have a related question, which you may have hinted at already, but is sort of how did you find PhD programs that give the best exposure in the field you wish to research? So this is more about the institution and the practicality of deciding, is this a good place to go?
I guess I can jump in there. So I knew originally I wanted to be one of the doctoral traineeship programs around the UK. I know there are a number of them. So I sort of limited my choices to those ones only. And then once I found this project through a supervisor, and I just went around the community and just like my undergrad was at UCL. I just went around to the different lecturers and just asked them if they knew the supervisor. Then just ask their opinion of them really, and just about the other uni. Are they a decent uni? Are they good at this? Because you got to make the most of the resources you have to hand at undergrad. And the geochemistry one, the geology one is relatively small anyway. It seems like most people know everyone anyway. So just, yeah.
Yeah, great to ask your existing colleagues.
I actually applied for quite a few years before I got on a program, and but I would only apply for maybe one project a year that seemed interesting, and then I would use any feedback that I got to inform how I could develop in that cycle. And so when I moved to Cardiff and started working on forums as a technician, I found that I enjoyed being in Cardiff, and I enjoyed the kind of workflow here. And so then I stopped applying for an interesting project around every year and started applying for a forum-based, Cardiff-based project every year. And, eventually something meshed with me
Yep.
I can go now. I guess I don't know that it's something I thought too specifically about. I think my master supervisor knew my PhD supervisor, so I knew that they would be a good person to work with. And I mean, I think I did my master's in the boron group in Southampton, and they're very closely linked to the boron group in St Andrews. So in that way, it kind of knew each other, and I knew that it would be a good place. And I spoke to the current PhD students of the group at the time I was applying, and that kind of thing. Yeah, to get a bit of a sense for the group.
Yep, so lots of good bits of advice. And finally, maybe Bridget.
Yeah, I didn't think very much about which institution. I thought quite carefully about supervisor and made sure whenever a project cropped up that I wouldn't apply for anything if I hadn't verified that I knew someone who knew them who could guarantee that they were a decent person. I didn't know enough about DTP politics and all of that to really even think about that sort of angle. And I didn't get a DTP project in the end anyway. It worked out absolutely fine from that angle. And also to a certain extent, I reckon that no matter how much I'd asked around, a certain amount of the politics of which department you end up in and how well you fit with it, you're never going to be able to figure that out before you get there. So a certain amount of, like, you can verify that this person, and you absolutely should verify that this person has had PhD students before and they've done well and speak well of them. But in terms of figuring out this department is a really brilliant fit for me, a certain amount of that you have to take on faith if it's not an institution you've been at before.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Well, I think that's lots of super helpful advice already. So let's assume, however, that you've picked a place, you've been successful, you're on a PhD program. The next couple of questions relate to sort of starting out in your first year and training. So what is something you wish you would have done during your first year? Who wants to start?
I wish that I had made a more concerted effort to organize files and papers. And when people say, write down the method a bit more broadly than you are doing, for a kind of writing up style as it happens, that's probably pretty good advice that you should probably do, because trying to collate it all at the end is probably more time consuming than it would have been. So yeah, I think I'd have spent more time kind of setting up structure in terms of so that I'd be able to reference my own work a bit better later on.
Yeah, definitely good tip. Anyone else?
Bear in mind that my second year was when the pandemic happened, which completely flavors in retrospect my first year, because I spent most of my first year figuring out how the new field worked and doing reading, and my second year was supposed to be in the lab. So in retrospect, that was an absolutely terrible decision. I don't think I could have seen that one coming, but also in retrospect, I might have needed to be a bit more assertive with my supervisor to show it, but I work to a certain extent better with if I got into the lab earlier, it might have informed my reading better. But that is also very much how it turns out that I operated, and I didn't know that at the time. So there are things that I would have done differently, but I think I had to do it badly the first time around to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that's also generally quite a good theme of doing a PhD, is that you figure out how to do things by the end of it. Any other thoughts, Joel?
Yeah, maybe in a slightly different vein. But doing a PhD is also a good opportunity to just, in a way, do university again. And so in your first year, it's arguably when you're going to be less stressed, have the least amount of things on your plate. So take the opportunity to get involved in PGR activity, in postgraduate activities. Take the opportunity to do events like these, to meet people in the wider community when you're just starting out, when you have arguably the most free time that you work with. It is a good opportunity to just do university again in a way, but just have a bit more freedom with it. And slightly less focused on the sort of researchy type of side, but just the more enjoying life type of side.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe Molly?
Yeah, I guess kind of similar to Bridget, COVID happened during my second year. But in the opposite, I spent my entire first year pretty much in the lab and did barely any reading, which worked out well, I guess, in terms of a pandemic. So I don't think I'd change that. I guess probably similar to Sophie, if I'd been more organized with my file management, which I still haven't sorted, and really still haven't got a good system in my postdoc now, which maybe I should get on that. Yeah, I think it's always good. Yeah, you'll never remember the paper you read in your first year if you haven't made notes. It's just not going to happen. Even if you think you will, if it's the most fundamental paper you'll ever read, it's just, you're not going to have the same memory of it when you come to write about it in your third year. If you don't take notes, it's lost forever. And so now I have a much better system of, if I read a paper, I'm going to write what I thought about it at the time. Even if I'm really tired and I think I haven't got good thoughts on it, I'm going to write what they are so that I know them later.
Cool, good. So one other question on this sort of, maybe in this slightly more specifically on the skills direction. We had a question which is, how can I make the best use of the offered skills training? But there's also a specific question in the chat, which might be relevant, especially for Joel, but for anyone, which basically says which coding languages might be best for a beginner starting PhD, especially if in hard rock geochemistry. So how to make the best of skills training and coding.
So I'll go first to the coding one. So I found that essentially mostly MATLAB and Python would be the biggest ones to use essentially for because they can work quite well with each other. And Python is it's a relatively, I know nothing's relatively easy to learn, but it's probably the most beginner language to learn. And there's loads of different tools you can use. This simple Jupyter notebook where you don't need to deal with installing a lot of stuff yourself. It just runs online and stuff. But specifically for hard rock stuff, so I work a lot with mass spectrometry I do, and a lot of the data you get off of that comes up in the files that you can open in Excel, for example. A lot of my data processing I do works in Excel, and all the Microsoft Office programs run on what's called Visual Basics, and it's a programming language. And if you can learn a little bit of that, how to manipulate it, then you can start writing macros, getting Excel to do automatic tasks for you. Then you can figure out ways to get Python to work with Excel files, and just essentially ways that you can really, really speed up your data processing. So compared to how long in my first year, it would take me, half a day maybe to process data that I'd get off the mass spec, whereas now I can do it in an hour or something. So yeah, really, take your first year to just learn ways to make your life more efficient. I think some would describe coding to me as, I tried to figure out to get a computer to do something so that I can go have a cup of tea, essentially, is what it is.
Nice. Does anyone else want to chip in on that question? You don't have to.
I guess I made it through my whole PhD not learning a coding language. So I guess depending on what you want to do, you might get away with Excel. But I think now in my postdoc, I've learned R. And I think there's a degree to which the best coding language to learn is the one that your supervisor or people in your group use, because then you can, if you get stuck, you can ask questions to people in your group and you can work on similar things, and that can work really well. So there can be that too.
This isn't in terms of training for coding languages, because like Molly, I don't really use anything other than just typing things into Excel. But for general training, I'd say in my first year was the year that I did the most training courses that were available through my university. And I did them in all sorts of things because I had no idea how to do writing, for example. So I did a 2-hour course about how to organize something for writing. And yeah, so I guess look around and see what's available in your institution, but there's also other resources outside of those. I remember I did a UEA online. This is even before the pandemic, but it was on, I think, Skype or something. I can't remember. It was on some platform anyway, not Zoom. And they put on seminars about things. It was like a small once a week for 4 weeks or something. But so yeah, have a look outside of your institution for different training that might be available for free.
Cool. And I don't know if, Bridget, you wanted to say anything about sort of skills and training more generally. I think we've covered the coding thing.
Yeah, in terms of skills and training, I think that's probably something that's going to be very specific to what you as a person want to know, and also what you need to know to be in your incredibly specific field. And clearly I'm not a hard rock geologist. With the coding and things, it's probably useful to, I mean, sure, learn one in detail, but being able to pull out a script that someone else has written in a language you don't know and be able to vaguely understand what's going on and at least get it to run is currently what I'm screaming and banging my head against, having never seen MATLAB before, but somehow people are writing in it. So even if you're focusing on one thing, it's good to have at least a vague idea of how to make stuff go in other stuff. But in terms of generalized training, I think it's a good idea to keep an eye on what's out there and think about both what it is that you think you really need to know, or you'll just go to everything else in the world, and also whether or not you think you're going to learn how to do this thing just from a 2-hour training course, or is it really going to take months of effort and practice on your part, in which case a 2-hour training course, you may as well spend that 2 hours learning. Some of the training courses, don't get me wrong, are really worth it, and then some of them are sitting in a room while someone tells you stuff you could have already guessed from a PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, I'm trying not to laugh at that point. Yeah, good. So let's move on. And the next topic is sort of moving fields. So we had a couple of questions in this direction, which is sort of similar. So for example, do you have any advice for someone who doesn't have a previous degree in geochemistry, but is using geochemistry methods in their PhD? And I guess I'll read the second one because it's pretty similar. I'm starting my PhD in astrobiology, dealing with meteorites, but my background is in microbiology. I've not had formal training in geochemistry, so do you have any tips for what and how I should study to gain knowledge in this field?
If I go first here, because I jumped field like that into geochemistry to a certain extent. Firstly, a PhD, you were not expected to know everything from the start. You were doing it in order to learn it. So it felt like I was on the back foot compared to people who had done their masters in the same thing or had done a technical role doing the same thing through all of my first year. But we all graduated just the same, and we all reached the same point. You are not expected to know the techniques when you start. Otherwise, they may as well just hand you a PhD. It will come with time. I honestly learned an awful lot of my field just by sitting down and banging my head against the literature, which probably isn't the best way of doing it. You can get an awful lot out of talking to other people in your lab group and asking all of the questions in the world, and eventually you'll cobble together some kind of working knowledge. And bear in mind, with a lot of the bits of geochemistry I'm in, and astrobiologists I know, they're incredibly interdisciplinary fields where people have come into it from so many different angles, and it's quite rare that someone has been doing it since the beginning. So everyone kind of feels like they're secretly not a geochemist or secretly not an astrobiologist. They're secretly this other thing, and therefore don't know all of this stuff they think they should know. Whatever background you have come from, that background has given you key skills which are probably going to be very important that other people don't know, and maybe you could pass on to them. And then equally, other people will know from other angles that you should listen to carefully and try and learn from.
Great advice. Yeah. So we planned it. We found someone that switched fields.
Maybe I can talk from my own experience on, so prior to doing my PhD, which was very lab based, I had no lab experience at all. My master's project was pretty much focused just looking down a microscope at once, and so being thrown into the lab then dealing with acids and chemicals or whatever was a shock. But how I found that I learned best was just not being afraid to make mistakes. Essentially, so like obviously mistakes can vary, like obviously dealing with some dangerous chemicals sometimes, but essentially not being afraid to just try things. And if things will go wrong in a PhD, it's just a matter of fact, essentially, and not letting that get you down or be afraid to just try things, try out a method, speak to your colleagues in the labs, your other PhD in years of postdocs who I'm sure will be more than happy to help you, but just, throwing yourself into the lab work if you're a practical learner and just trying things and essentially learning by trial and error sometimes is how I find it sometimes the best way to learn.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess I didn't switch fields, but I do know that for other things that I wanted to learn when I started my PhD, you at St Andrews, you can speak to the lecturer of the class and you can ask to just sit in the back. Or if you like the hard mode of that, you can demonstrate the class, and teaching is a great way to learn things. So if you sign up to demonstrate a class on something you really want to learn, you will absolutely have to learn it because you will very quickly be explaining it to people. So that's a way to make yourself learn things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Like newbies in geochemistry, go and teach first year geochemistry, or for that matter, fourth year geochemistry or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to reiterate what Bridget said is no one expects a first year PhD student to be super knowledgeable about the subject. It is a training thing. And so in terms of the practical geochemistry skills, you're effectively just learning from other people, because unless you're doing a method development project, there'll be a method already in place. And I guess even if you're doing method development, there'll be some sort of skeleton structure to work off and build from. And then in terms of the knowledge behind the proxies, yeah, talking to people is great. I guess if you want to be real challenged, then demonstrating is a good way to do it too.
And I guess nowadays there's also quite a lot of webinars from, seminar talks and these kind of things, or plenaries from conferences and stuff. So even without going to a conference, even in your first year, you could see experts in the field talking about some of these topics as well, right? Great. That's got lots of moving fields things covered, I think. But nevertheless, that started to draw us towards the lab. And so a couple of things about doing lab work. There's two questions here. One is simply sort of what suggestions do you have for working effectively and efficiently in a lab? And we'll just start with that one, in fact. Since you're there, Sophie, do you want to carry on?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's normally some sort of methodology protocol that gets written around risk assessment of the procedure that will guide everything. But I don't think that anyone's going to be 100% efficient or effective when they first start, and that kind of goes to what Joel was saying of you do make mistakes. Like you maybe don't make the same decision as you would, with an extra 2 years of experience behind you, and that's just part of the process. And then what Molly said of, what did you say? Like, if you don't make a note about it, it never happened, or it's lost forever or something, is do have a lab notebook. Absolutely have a lab notebook, so that, and be really honest in it. So if you're inefficient, you don't then repeat that mistake or something. But it just takes time and practice to be better at it. So if you can self-reflect in a not really self-critical way, but just in an honest way, then you can become more effective and efficient over time. You shouldn't expect to be immediately.
I'd say maybe that with lab work a lot of the time is maybe it goes against being efficient, but be flexible with your time with it sometimes, because a lot of the time you don't always know how long things will take processes. So like if you're doing some ion exchange columns or something, you don't necessarily know how long it's going to take. And so this is the thing where once you start doing it and learn, you'll get a better handle on how long things take and start planning your days more accordingly. But definitely at the start of the day, if you don't get everything done in the day that you want to get done, don't be annoyed about it. Don't be mad at yourself. If you're like, okay, I can learn from this. I see how long this process is going to take. Maybe then it means, okay, if I want to finish by 5 p.m., maybe I need to come in an hour earlier or something like that. Just oftentimes things in the lab, they take how long they take. You can't really do anything about it. It's just the way it is. And just, learn to plan your time around that. And also so if you want to have a lab day, just clear everything out of your schedule. Just be like, today, all I'm going to do is be in the lab. And that's fine. That is, even if you don't get a lot done or something, just be like, today I'm just going to focus on doing lab work, whether that's cleaning beakers, cleaning pipette tips, or whatever, or just, doing general prep work.
Yeah, I think when I did my master's, I got a great piece of advice that I love from the PhD student who supervised me, to write down the time that you start a job and the time you finish a job, or if you're doing columns or chemistry, to write down the time it takes each step. And I love it because I'm really competitive with myself to be really fast and efficient, but also because if you start a day of columns, for example, and you know how long the cleanings takes in the beginning, then you know, oh, I'm 2 hours away from being done, so I can text my friends when I'll be finished, and I can know how long things take me, so I can plan around that. And yeah, it's really useful to know that it takes me half an hour to clean this thing, and therefore I can squeeze that in before the meeting, or, you know, and plan things around that way. And also you get faster and more efficient through time. It always takes a while in the beginning, and you get that speed. And yeah, it's good to take your time in the beginning and make sure you're doing things right and get good practice in before you try and do things fast. And also, I guess, in terms of efficiency, I find that for me, lab work uses a different part of my brain than writing. And so in terms of like work efficiency, often I'll be writing and I'll get stuck on what I'm doing. I'll be like, oh, I'll just go into the lab and clean some beakers for half an hour, and then I'll come back. And so in the time that I would have maybe spent being stuck on what I'm writing, I instead spend it cleaning some beakers and doing something really practical. And then I come back to it and I've figured out the problem. And yeah, it works for me.
I think finally, my bit of advice is, unless you have all the facilities in the world and also know what you're doing, you're not going to be working in the lab alone. There are probably going to be quite a lot of other people doing similar or different things in the same space. And there's almost certainly going to be a culture attached to the lab that you're going into. Figuring out that culture, getting to know the technicians, getting to know how things operate, what the washing up protocols are, what's considered acceptable and what isn't. Is there a lab WhatsApp group, or how do you communicate when you need someone quickly to help you? So picking up on all of those cultural cues and figuring out who to ask for help for what thing, what the timeframes are for that sort of thing. You're not doing it alone, and you absolutely shouldn't be thrown into a lab alone, because that is incredibly unsafe. And yeah, if you have to slow down in order to do things carefully and safely, then that is always a better option than striving for the most efficient or the fastest way of doing it. If nothing else, it will save you time, and it will probably save you health as well. So, and yeah, there will be days when you look down at your hands and your hands are shaking and your brain is kind of foggy, and it's, don't go near a lab on those. Know when to call it quits, because you will at best screw up samples and at worst screw up yourself. And when you should go and quietly sit at your desk and read papers, but then equally keep an eye on when you think that you might be in a really good mindset for lab work. But yeah, make sure that you know how to work with the other people in the lab is my main piece of advice, because they can and will help you out, and you should and will help them out.
Perfect. Great. So I think that, in fact, I think that will do with lab work. I think you've covered so many good things there. We'll move on and talking about people and things. Obviously, a key person in a PhD is your supervisor, as was sort of alluded to earlier with some of the discussing where you decided to go and do PhDs. So here's a good example of a supervisor question. My two supervisors, often you might have more than one PhD supervisor. My two supervisors have different expertise and mentoring styles, and sometimes offer different suggestions for my project. So how can I effectively maintain productive and harmonious communications with both advisors to reach a consensus? So in other words, how do you deal with things when your supervisors have different advice? Silence.
I mean, I guess I had one main supervisor and several minor supervisors. So, but I mean, I would say that, you know, at the end of the day, it's your project. And you might not feel this, especially in your first year, that you can make this, but if you have, you should see what you feel, and you can, and even if that's not the same thing that your supervisor feels, it's your project. And at the end of the day, especially towards the later stage of your PhD, you will be the person who's spent the most time thinking about it, and you should make the call. You could also maybe organize a meeting with all of you there, and you could all discuss it together. But yeah, I don't know if I am the perfect person to speak on this.
Fair enough. But there's definitely something that might evolve through a PhD project, as you say.
Yeah, I think that just to reiterate what Molly said is that at the end of the day, they are your supervisors and they are giving their advice. It's not necessarily gospel. You don't necessarily need to do what they say. In your first year, it can be difficult, and it will come with time where you learn to trust yourself more, essentially, where if you may not agree with them and you agree with the other supervisor, that's totally fine. Like, you're allowed to disagree with your supervisor, you're allowed to say no to them, you know, but it does take time, and it does to build up that confidence to have that. But, you know, I'd say maybe think back to what I would like to have done more in my early years was, you know, trust myself more and try more, because I find that is the best way to learn, when you just, you're like, no, I should be where I am in this, but I got this PhD, this is my project, I can take charge of it, and maybe it'll go wrong, maybe it won't, but, you know, just have to try.
Yeah, I haven't really gone through that. I've got multiple supervisors, and they have kind of different styles of communicating and different styles of different styles of supervision, basically. But there's not been a time that, you know, I've felt kind of pulled between them about how to proceed. But I guess if you don't feel experienced enough to take what they've said separately about, say, the direction of a project, and then make your own decision, then maybe more communications needed, and you do need a meeting with all the views there, so that a kind of team way forward is found, I guess. You know, if you don't feel like you're in that stage where you can make the decision on your own.
Yeah, again, this is maybe not the best panel for it, because that didn't ever really come up for me, but I can absolutely see it coming up when now I'm trying to juggle different co-authors on papers, so it's going to happen eventually, probably. It just kind of sucks that it's happening so early in your PhD, because it's not a fun position to be in, and I know people who've been in it, and it can range from reasonably healthy disagreement and debate on methods to something that's really unpleasant to be between. And how you approach it is going to depend on which of those extremes you're leaning towards. Assuming it's not an abusive supervisor situation, which is a whole different kettle of fish, I think it's probably worth really considering both of their points and trying to work out what you think the best approach is, even if you're in your first year and you don't feel like you have the expertise to be able to make that, to assert yourself in this situation. Try and understand where they're both coming from and why they've both reached those conclusions, because that might help you reach your own.
Yeah, no, that's definitely good advice. And I think it's sort of the benefit of having 2 or 3 supervisors is you get the chance to get 2 or 3 different viewpoints, 2 or 3 different perspectives, some different experiences coming into those ideas. But then it does give you that question about having to decide which bits of the advice to take, right? But that's kind of part of the fun as well, as long as it's, as you say, in a kind of constructive situation. Okay, and one more, which sort of relates to supervisors and colleagues. How do you deal with the challenge of accessing resources? And that could be interpreted kind of widely, I suppose, when they're mostly used by more senior people. Does anyone have any sort of experience or thoughts on what that might be?
Is the question kind of talking about, like, I guess, lab resources, or? I guess
I'm not quite sure. I guess it could be, or it could be more generally. But yeah, if you think about, I guess, access to sediment cores or access to a mass spec, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, in St Andrews, we had a great lab manager who sorted out that everyone got a fair access to the mass spectrometer. And hopefully, if you're in a lab, you should have a great lab manager who kind of is the what's it called? The person who's not involved, who is like unbiased and who is fair. And in your PhD, often you have a time limit and a deadline. And so people are generally pretty nice about giving you priority, especially if you've got a conference coming up or something that needs to happen quickly, to give you priority to get your measurements done. And people, in my experience, have been really lovely about that.
Yeah, if the question is asking about like getting use of lab equipment or machines or whatever, then oftentimes, yeah, sometimes people have pressing deadlines where they need to put the machine out for a whole week to work. But what I found was really helpful to me in my first year with learning just general lab techniques and how to use a mass spec, for example, was even if, I wasn't doing any of my own data and my own samples, was just going and sitting by someone on the mass spec and just watching them use it, or going and watch someone do columns, of just essentially learning by osmosis, because you take in way more than you realize by just watching and asking stupid questions, asking why has someone done this, why are you doing that, and just hopefully they're happy to have you there and don't find you an annoyance, and they should be happy to explain what they're doing. But yeah, that's how I find was a good way to get my head around all the different machines and equipment in the lab, was just like watching other people use them.
I think if you're having problems because it's more senior people specifically, whether or not that's a later on PhD student or emeritus professor barging in, to a certain, if it's the problem that they are more senior and they're throwing their weight around, or you're perceiving them as that, then it's probably a case of you need to talk to your supervisor about it, because it is you are not less valid of having lab time because you've been in there less long, and do need to use it to produce your samples as well. And if you need to go to your supervisor of a lab PI for help in that situation, then there isn't a problem with doing that. But there is also a case of you need to ask yourself critically of how urgent are these samples? Do I need this time, and have I had my allocated and fair amount of time? And if the answer is no, then you need to figure out how to get that. But sometimes the answer is also, yes, I have had a fair amount of time, I just need even more. At which point the answer might be, well, I can't take up the entire time on this thing. Other people do also need it. And maybe, everyone has got deadlines, and everyone has desperately got stuff they need to get done. And everyone has times when they really, really need a full week to get this data for a conference or something. And everyone has times when that's not the case. So be assertive when you need it and be kind when you don't, is probably my advice. And it's an annoying and a hard thing to learn those two things and how to balance them, but it's a skill that comes with time. And when you understand the lab culture, it gets easier.
Yeah, and hopefully in a good lab, it's not too challenging because everyone sort of is playing by the same rules and kind of gets this, right? But yeah, definitely being sort of flexible, but also realizing that things should be fair, I guess, is quite important in a good lab culture. Great, I think we'll move on to, we've got a couple more topics to discuss, time's flying by. One question then is just on writing. And one question which may or may not be answerable here, but maybe is, how is writing a PhD thesis different in the UK compared to in other countries? Because of course, I think all of you have only written one PhD thesis so far.
I guess, I wrote my PhD in the UK. I'm now in France. So I guess I know that in France, there are no thesis corrections, which is strange to me. And it's in France, you have to have a paper published, or 2 papers published and 1 submitted. Whereas in the UK, the rules at St Andrews at least are very relaxed about that. And I had no papers published in my thesis and did more of a kind of book chapter style thesis. But you do have normally the option in the UK to also do a thesis by publication. And I think in different countries, it varies, how much you need to have papers published and things look like papers versus how much things look more like chapters. And I think it also might vary university to university. So, yeah.
Yeah, as you say, it definitely varies even institution to institution within the UK. Typically in the UK, it used to be a bit more like what you described, with sort of chapters of sort of connected work that eventually might make their way into papers down the line. I think some universities are becoming in the UK more flexible with allowing chapters to basically be papers. As you say, in several countries abroad, often there's more of a requirement for publication as a sort of validation of the chapters, but of course that also probably varies from institute to institute. So I've conducted a Viva in France, and they had a couple of chapters submitted as papers but not published, and that was fine. So even within the same country, you can have slightly different rules from institution to institution. But I think the principles otherwise would be quite similar in that you were publishing new work, and the basis for separated into several different chunks that are somewhat related by a theme. Does anyone else want to jump in, or shall we move on? Okay, let's move on. So, okay, what about, so another topic coming towards the end is about managing your time and sort of maintaining work-life balance, these kinds of topics. We have several questions here. Let's start with what strategies did you find most effective for time management and productivity? And there is a related one which says, what are the best practices to finish a PhD in 3 years? I can't answer that question.
Maybe I'd say on the topic of finishing a PhD within 3 years, maybe don't have in your mind that I want to get X, Y, and Z done by the end of my time, but more so say the PhD is whatever I can produce within the 3 years. So whatever you have by the end of 3 years, I'm sure it would be enough for a PhD. Maybe don't set yourself unrealistic goals. Obviously, it's good to aim high and stuff like that, but you have to be realistic with how long things take, especially in geochemistry sometimes. So yeah, so with geochemistry, it is difficult, I think, with time management, because some things are out of your control sometimes, like how long it may take to get samples from a core or something, how long there are things that are outside of your control sometimes, and so really don't beat yourself up about it sometimes, and just allow plan for things to go wrong, have contingency plans in place. If this goes wrong, that's fine. I'm going to then shift my focus onto this. Essentially, just don't be too hard on yourself, and then don't expect yourself to work 18 hours a day or something, because it's just not healthy, and you just won't have fun. Really.
Yeah, no, definitely. Other tips for time management, productivity?
I guess, yeah, at the end of the day, it will never feel done. Like you can keep going on the same question, and like I still have thoughts about my PhD questions that are unanswered, and I could probably keep going for like 10 years and not finish answering all the questions I have on the topic. So at the end of the day, you have to kind of be like, okay, I feel like I've answered enough of this and I have enough for a thesis and I'm happy with where it is, and kind of, yeah, decide when you want to do it. And it might never feel like you've answered and ticked every box, because yeah, it just doesn't it will never get to that point, really.
Similarly, I'm in the middle of writing up, and I had this thought about some data analysis that I could do, but I know that would take me time that I don't have to dedicate to it, and so that's going to wait. And if and when I write it up, then as a paper, then I will think about tackling it then. So the being realistic about what you can and can't include, I think is great. And then in terms of being productive, I think a really good work-life balance for an academic, I guess, but I only work outside of 9 to 5 if there's a very specific thing coming up, like if there's a conference I'm going to, so I need to finish off the presentation or whatever. But as a general rule, I really restrict myself in working hours, because I find that if I push myself too hard for more than a day or two and do really long days, then I'm super unproductive during the working. I don't think I'm getting any more done, because I'm just really tired and slow about how I'm doing stuff. So on like the cost benefit analysis of doing it, it's just not worth it for me. So yeah, don't feel like hitting your head against the screen until 8 o'clock in the evening every night is going to be really helpful, because for you it might not be.
Yeah, that's what I found writing up, is I didn't have a choice but to do an awful lot of hours from somewhere, because in the end I had to basically write the whole thing in 3 months because of how various timelines suddenly got moved up. But the thing I found from doing that was everyone works in different ways, and everyone can do different things and is capable of different things, and what you're capable of changes over time. So the best time management strategies I found were ones which changed over time. Like something might work for a week or two to persuade myself to keep reading the papers rather than staring into space. But then maybe it stopped working after a while and have to find something else. So keeping a really strong eye on what's working and what isn't. Keeping an eye on, can I work late into, so it turned out that I, for the end of my PhD, was absolutely fine at working really late into the evenings, and I wouldn't like to do it long term, but I could do that for a couple of months. But I was absolutely incapable of working weekends. A friend who was in a reasonably similar situation solidly did 9 to 5 every day, but then did weekends as well, but refused to work in the evenings because that's what worked for him. So figure out for yourself what you're capable of doing, what your most productive rather than most hours spent sitting at your desk is. Also try and allocate those hours and keep an eye on, we're all scientists, try and science how you're working and keep an eye on how you work best and when you work best. Like I noticed that I was extremely brain dead and very fuzzy between about 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. So I tended to save that time for doing something completely mindless like making figures. And then I was best at reading papers early in the morning when I hadn't had to do something else. And then I was best at writing up later into the evening when it was finally dawning on me that I hadn't done all that much that day. So, but that's purely how it worked for me. It will work completely differently for someone else. And other people might be much better at solidly sitting down 9 to 5 and using every single minute in that time. And other people might be better at working 9 o'clock till 7 in the evening, but taking longer breaks during that time. And you need to figure out for yourself what the right fit for you is. Same with whether or not you work in the office versus work at home, whether you work in an odd corner of the lab versus at your desk where there might be people talking. Try out all of these things, see what works, and don't be afraid to say, this used to work, I don't think it is anymore, I'm going to change it.
Perfect. Yeah, so it's definitely a case of saying it's very much to each person. We have different approaches and different things that work for us, but there's definitely some useful thoughts there. We're getting in close to the hour, and we have got through a good proportion of the questions. That's good. I think we'll finish with the question, well, the 2 questions. You can decide which of these 2 you want to answer. What was the best moment in your PhD? And or what is your top tip for a new PhD student? So feel free to answer on one or both.
I'm going to go with top tip. My top tip is trying not to be too afraid of looking stupid by asking stupid questions. I think it's probably good to be self-aware enough to know when you don't know something, and to be able to communicate well enough to ask those basic questions that you feel silly for asking. But it's really, I think, a great skill. Yeah,
no, definitely. And they're barely as stupid as you think they are often.
Exactly.
Because they're often quite hard to answer. And or maybe quite fundamental. So no, that's definitely true. Who wants to go next?
I think in terms of a top tip as well, try and be friendly, even if you don't want to make friends with other PhD students in the department, and also other people in the department who aren't your supervisor. Because I think especially with so many people who are working from home and they might come into the office for a meeting, it's quite hard, it's quite easy to lose track of that community. And it is incredible, in a very selfish point of view, ignoring the fact they're usually nice people, it is very, very useful to be able to lean over to someone else and ask them how the heck this bit of bureaucracy works and how the university is put together. And third-year PhD students, even from a completely different field, know how the department works and is put together in a way that is extremely useful. And also, they are usually really good people to just get to know in general, and they usually have their own social activities between them, which are usually fun. Everyone in that department is someone who has signed up to do a PhD, which you have to be a little bit crazy to want to do. So usually you'll end up finding that you fit in reasonably well with them. maybe it's survivorship bias because I did fit in reasonably well for mine and other people didn't, but I think it's certainly worth giving it a shot to try and integrate yourself into the group of people there.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, be a part of the community. Joel?
Yeah, I'd say, which is really difficult to do, is but really try to not compare yourself to others, especially in geochemistry, because a lot of things with geochemistry can be quite slow going. They can be. So when you're sitting at the end of your first year or halfway through your second year, and you're looking at your geophysicist or paleontologist sitting next to you talking about their paper that just got published from their first year, and then you're sitting there, you've only done a few samples or something, you can feel pretty bad about yourself, but you really have to try and not compare yourself to others and just focus on your own project and what you're doing. Be happy for them, great, but like do your own work, do your own PhD, and just, you know, focus on what you're doing. And comparing yourself to others, it can really just be a bad, not great for your mental health, really.
Yeah, I guess I could say a different thing would be don't be afraid to make your PhD your own. It's like it's a training opportunity, it's a learning opportunity, and think about what you want to get out of the PhD, and don't be afraid, even if it was a specific project that you signed up for, to make it the thing that you want to get out of it, and to make it your own, and to make it go in the direction that you're excited and interested for it to be in.
Great, I think that's a nice way to finish. So thank you so much to the four of you for joining and sharing your experiences and reliving parts of your PhD with us this afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining. As I say, take a look at the YouTube page for the Geochemistry group if you're interested in things like paper writing and applying for postdocs and some of these other topics. And let myself or Sophie know if you see there's topics we've not covered that you think you'd like to see us cover in the coming year. And otherwise, yeah, just thanks so much and have a good afternoon, everyone.